Hi, and welcome to Professor Pincushion. I'm Tova, and today I'm going to show you how to do the hairline seam. This narrow seam is ideal for shears and chiffon type fabrics. Not only is the hairline seam very easy to accomplish, but it'll be less noticeable than traditional seams. Since shears are usually transparent enough that you'll be able to see that seam allowance, we want to make sure it looks as nice as possible. Let's go ahead and get started. Here's an example so we can see the difference between a regular seam and a hairline seam. Now this is a fairly common technique, the hairline seam, to use for chiffon type fabric and other similar weighted fabric. You obviously don't want to do this technique with mid to heavyweight fabrics. It just doesn't work out as well and it starts getting bulky. With the regular seam, you can see our seam allowance is fairly big and it's coming through, or at least you can visually see it, to the right side, or when you're looking at the right side of the fabric. Also, with this type of fabric, it does fray pretty badly, so you're going to start seeing it fray on the seam allowance on the edge, and you're going to see it as you're looking at the right side, and it's just going to start looking really sloppy. With the hairline seam, you can see we try to minimize that seam allowance so it's as small as possible, and even though we can still see it, it's not really that distracting. Also, if we look at the other side, it looks fairly neat. We did a zigzag stitch, so it's not fraying as bad, and it'll probably keep more in check as opposed to if we left it unchecked on this side. Now, there are some people who would prefer to do a French seam, which means that the seam allowance would be enclosed altogether. The nice thing about the hairline seam is that it can be done on straight seams and curved seams. While with the French seams, they tend to be a little bit more tricky on the curved seams. They don't lie as flat as with the hairline seam. And with my personal experience, I think the French seam ends up being a little bit more stiff than the hairline seam since we don't have as many folds as with the French seam. It's a little bit more flexible. So when you're working with something like chiffon, you want it to look soft, and with this hairline seam, it continues to maintain that softness, while with the French seam, it's still going to be soft, but not as soft. I'll show you a couple of examples of a hairline seam. So we're just going to do a very simple one first. You're just going to take your two pieces and place them together right side to right side, and you're going to pin the edge that you want to do your seam. We're going to first do a straight stitch where you want your seam line to be. So if your pattern is 5/8 of an inch, I'm going to make sure I do it 5/8 of an inch from the raw edge. All right, so I'm sewing the regular seam at my 5/8 seam allowance. And if you have trouble sewing with this type of fabric, I know it can be a little tricky, you can spray it with spray starch if your fabric is washable, just to kind of stiffen it up a little bit and make it a little bit easier to sew with. Next, I'm going to do a zigzag stitch right on the other side of the seam line. So here's my seam line, so I'm going to go towards the seam allowance and do my zigzag stitch up here for the full length. My zigzag stitch is a narrow, smaller zigzag stitch. So for my stitch length, it's a 1.6. The stitch width is a 3. And I'm trying to get close to my seam line without actually going over that first straight seam line that I created. Trim off your excess seam allowance close to the top of your zigzag stitch. You don't actually want to cut into your stitches. You just want to get pretty close because, again, we want our seam allowance to be incredibly small. To finish, press your seam allowance to one side. You're going to want to use the heat on your iron that's appropriate for the type of fabric you're using. So it's probably not going to be very hot. I'm doing it on the back side, and then I'm going to press again on the right side. Here's my finished seam. Now obviously you want to use a matching color thread so it doesn't stand out like mine does. Let's take a look at the other side. So that's what it looks like on the back. So you can see it's a fairly neat looking seam to do with this type of fabric. Let's do a different example. So we're going to start it the same way. I'm taking my two pieces, I'm placing them together right side to right side and pinning along where I want to do my seam line. So instead of doing my straight stitch first, this time I'm just going to do at my seam line a zigzag stitch, the same small narrow zigzag stitch. So we're skipping the straight stitch altogether, and the zigzag stitch is now at the seam line. The difference is I have a little bit of my pearl cotton floss here, and again, you want to use a matching color. I'm just using contrasting so it's easier to see. And I'm placing it at my seam line. I'm just going to hold it as I'm sewing it. So when I'm doing my zigzag stitch, it's going over my floss. Now what this floss is doing is it's strengthening the seam line. Also, it adds a little bit of weight and stability. This is a good idea if you're doing something like a collar or a cuff. So it's adding stability to the edge of that collar. With this type of sewing, I recommend using an open toe foot. It just makes it a little bit easier for when you're sewing with a cord like this in place. You'll notice that I don't have the end of my pearl cotton thread directly on the end. I gave myself a bit of wiggle room. This just makes it easier to start the stitch than trying to fiddle with this and make sure the end is exact. So you leave it long, you can always trim it off later. Now you may notice with your seam that if you accidentally pull this, you might start pulling it through. So even if you cut off your threads, leave a little bit of length to this. So then once you do a seam that goes across, that's going to stitch it into place, and then you can trim it later. Just like before, after you do this seam, you can go ahead and trim off the excess seam allowance close to the top of that zigzag stitch. If you're asking yourself, well, why can't I skip the straight stitch and just do the zigzag stitch by itself? You could do that, but there is one downside, and here's an example I did of a collar I started to create. And I just did a zigzag stitch, and I have my pearl cotton thread in between the stitch. Now you'll notice that this is not a perfect straight edge. It kind of looks a little bit scallopy. That's because there's no straight stitch to kind of straighten that out. Now that's because it's on an edge. So if you do a seam where it's just going to end up looking like this and you're just going to press it flat, it's not going to be noticeable at all. So you really don't have to worry about that. Also, it's up to you on whether or not you want to have the side where you can see the pearl cotton thread facing up, so it would be the top side, or you have it going the other way so the pearl cotton thread ends up being on the back. I kind of prefer it to be on the back, but if you're using matching colors, it's probably not going to be that noticeable anyways. We hope the next time that you find yourself working with chiffon, you consider giving the hairline seam a try. We hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Please subscribe to get notified of our weekly releases. Also check out ProfessorPincushion.com to view our complete library with well over 350 sewing tutorials. If you would like to directly support us, you can check out our Patreon campaign and earn some exclusive perks. Thanks for watching.